Good morning, plant breeders, plant scientists, and everybody fired up about breeding crops. Hey, this is David Benson, CEO and founder of Cornhusker Hybrids LLC, located in York, in Lincoln, Nebraska, where our trademark and mantra is success starts with the seed. No truer words have ever been said. Hey, today we're going to finish the second part of the two-part series on population size. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer or admittance is that my video got shut off last week because of the size of the cloud space that I had storage space left, and I had to stop it. It just happened to stop at a spot that I could go forward with. I have a son that's a cloud architect for Microsoft, and of course he was able to straighten his dad out. So hopefully today we can get this finished. But where I left off was talking about effective population sizes, and that I'm an advocate of small population sizes, smaller population sizes than many breeders work with and any crops they work with, because it works. And I finished up talking about a lifelong breeder named Leroy McCurdy, who I met in my first job that I had getting out of college, that had never had any education, started breeding corn in the 30s on his own, and they built a very successful company, and Leroy had a lot of really good hybrids. And at the end of the day, AgriGenetics paid him a bunch of money for his germplasm, and what Leroy did was essentially take small populations out of every single thing in the world, more or less. So I'll just go on from that. I would say again that I said before that I've never met an F2 population I didn't like personally. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but I believe you got to work most of them. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things you can do now to increase your probabilities of working the best populations, at least based on the data you have, and narrow that down. I mean, you can do DNA chipping now, and you can know a lot about the genetic constitution of your materials before you ever start, and you have the phenotypic. But at the end of the day, you end up with some material that's going to be your breeding program, and you got to decide, if you've got constraints, you've got limits on your population, on your budget, how you're going to spend your budget to help the company succeed. And the goal of the company should be to gain market share and to make positive genetic gain. So having said that, I'll just drop back in here and talk a little bit more about, just to finish this out, about what I know personally from small population size and how successful it could be. And I'll even use a few names, and hopefully that's not a big problem. I don't think it is. But when I got hired, there was a fellow named Joe Keyshaw that hired me. He was a real advocate of breeding into Pioneer. And Joe, one of his main claims to fame was that he developed what was and may still be the most largest selling hybrid in the world. He had the seed parent of, and this was the largest selling hybrid for a long time. This hybrid sold more bags than most companies had. And that female inbred that Joe developed came out of a very small population size, rumored to be 2. That's what I always heard, and there was 2 commercials come out of that. Now, was that the only one of those populations that Pioneer worked? Oh, heavens no. A lot of other breeders worked it, but they never found it. And Norm Williams, who was a longtime breeder at York when I started, he says, Dave, you may know how many of these A by B, I'll call them A by B populations, to keep that proprietary, that this company worked. And then Joe was able to find it. So anyway, it was a huge inbred, and it came out of a very small population size. When I went into Pioneer, I was a little surprised at first by the population size that most of the breeders had, because they were extremely small, 10 to 20. Some people were even smaller than that. I think Steve Noble was running like 4, and then he would take a GCA of the combined of the 4, and then he would decide which ones of those that he thought were the best based on the GCA of the 4, and then of course he could run more of them the next year. I mean, one thing about Pioneer, we were never afraid to run the same F2 more than once, at least in those days. And so personally, myself, because of the way my budget was set up, I followed Stan Jensen at York, and he was probably one of the most successful corn breeders Pioneer ever had. Was an RD for years, was the first hire west of the Missouri River for Pioneer, and he set up the station in the 50s to do drought research. But anyway, I took over Stan, and he was an RD, and he still had a very small program. And it was very small because he was an RD. He wasn't supposed to have a program, but he still did. And that's what I took over. And you don't replace people like that. You follow them, right? But anyway, when I set up my program and when I got started and as things evolved during my 8 years at Pioneer, I essentially used population sizes of 8 to 12. And then I would take half of those and put on one tester and half on another. I would try to test them in different environments if I could. And, that's what I did. And then I would run enough tests to get me give me the selections that would work for my next generation of testing. And so I used extremely small population size. We were extremely successful doing that. And we were just starting to get into using breeding values, moving from GCAs into breeding values. Breeding values were starting to be generated, using marker data. And now, of course, you've got genomic breeding values. You have a lot of things you can do, but we didn't have them then. But we used small population sizes. And, my feeling is, again, like I said in the first, if I had to take 2,000 populations with one or one population with 2,000, if that was all I had, I would take the 2,000 populations with one. I just think you'd look at a lot more genetic variance. And again, I would mention that what we're trying to do is increase our chances, and I hate to say it, we increase our chances for success, but we also want to increase our chances to get a lucky sample, right? I mean, everything's a sampling dilemma. I mean, if you got 60,000 genes segregating, and I think it takes most of the land in the world to grow all those. So, I mean, you can't do that. You're going to work with small subsample, however you do it. And whether you look at what I did, I just looked at as I had a stiff stock population and a non-stiff stock population of inbreds. I was going to derive lines from them. I was going to cross them together and get my next generation hybrid. That's essentially what we did. That's what you get paid for. So again, I would like to close that I am a firm believer in small population sizes. Now, I know there's a lot more information out there now and everything else, but there's so much that we can't explain that happens genetically, particularly in corn. And even going back to how we could have started with 8 to 10 lines really and still be working progenies of these 8 to 10 lines and still have genetic variation for continuing selection. I've never seen anybody explain that to me how that's possible yet. So we don't know it all. So I'd just like to close that way. And the other thing I'd like to say is I've got some things that I've done here where I have put together some of the elite PVPs, stiff stocks, and elite PVPs, non-stiff stocks, and random mated those, a really big sample for now 3 generations. And I've got some unbelievable breeding material. There are thousands of ears now that I need to figure out what to do with. I also have these same basic gene pools crossed with African germplasm. The African germplasm was white, right? But I also had some white lines. I crossed it all together, and that's some really unique stuff. Nobody in the world has it. And I'm trying to work through how I'm going to work this. Now, obviously, when you're working in a situation like this, a lot of these PVP lines have genomic data, they have phenomic data, they have marker data, they've been used in studies, some of them. So there's a lot of information out there. But still, I think that it is the greatest gene pool imaginable to work with. So I'm trying to figure out how to work with. Now, obviously, I'm not going to, in a situation like this is a different situation. I need to think about how to sample most of that variance and retain what I can that's useful with the least amount of resources. And maybe I got to look at 1,000 lines or 2,000 lines. Well, if you're a small program like me, that may take me a very long time looking at so many a year as I figure out how to do this. But again, I want to close today, encourage people to think about the population sizes they use, whether you're working in cassava or groundnut or chickpea or maize or popcorn or sorghum or watermelons or sweet corn, whatever it is, just think about it. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit about tolerance, field tolerance versus resistance in corn breeding. So that's where I'm going to leave it today.